Hello, this is Christina Jang from ITDP, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. Before we begin, there are just a few things to note. Yes, this webinar is recorded, and we will provide the recording and the PowerPoint as well online within 2 weeks. You will also receive a link from me after the webinar that will direct you to the link for the recording and to download the PowerPoint. To interact with our host today, please use the Q&A function, which should appear at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we ask that you refrain from using the chat box because we're unable to see all the questions there. So please just use the Q&A, the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Thank you again all for joining us today for the webinar Planning Bikeshare for Everyone. Cities on every continent offer bikeshare to residents and visitors alike, and the shared mode continues to spread to cities large and small through university campuses, employment centers, and even residential developments. Highly successful systems such as in Mexico City, EcoBC, and also throughout China have helped to promote cycling as a viable and valued transport option. Today, the webinar will highlight findings and recommendations from the ITDP 2018 Bikeshare Planning Guide, which was recently released both in print and online, with the goal of designing and implementing bikeshare systems that are equitable, sustainable, financially sound, and operate within a diverse transportation network. Today, our presenter is Dana Yanocha, who is a Senior Research Associate for our ITDP office in Washington, D.C. She recently presented the updated Bikeshare Planning Guide at Mobilize Dar es Salaam this past June and has also hosted a webinar on her policy brief, Optimizing Dockless Bikeshare for Cities. You can also find that on our ITDP website. Dana's work includes research and analysis of trends in sustainable transportation and development, identifying connections between social, economic, and environmental spheres of sustainable development, and also providing guidance for cities to strengthen transportation networks. So now, Dana, I can hand it off to you. And when you would like, you can start sharing your screen.
Okay. Okay. Are you able to see that, Christina? Does that look okay?
Yep, everything is clear on my end.
Great. Okay. All right. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. And thanks, Christina, for that great introduction. So I'll just jump right into it. As far as the agenda for today's presentation, like Christina mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on ITDP's recently released Bikeshare Planning Guide. Some of the kind of pieces that I wanted to pull out in particular are looking at how to make some decisions about different operator scenarios. I'll talk through some of the key recommendations from the planning guide. And then look a little bit at some of the trends that we're expecting to see when we look at the next year or so of Bikeshare. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end for some Q&A. So ITDP released the original Bikeshare Planning Guide in 2013, and the idea was to provide really in-depth guidance on how to think about bikeshare as part of a city's transportation network. So really encouraging cities to design and expand systems that help to meet broader sustainability and mobility goals. And the original planning guide also included suggestions for how to quantify and analyze bikeshare system performance over time, as well as using common metrics to compare systems in different cities to each other. And this really helped to inform and kind of paint a picture of how bikeshare was working across the world. So then, since 2013, as many of us know, there have been a lot of changes across the bikeshare landscape. And so we undertook this effort to update the Bikeshare Planning Guide and really focus on those recent innovations that have seriously impacted how bikeshare is planned and implemented. And I'm going to go through some of those later in the presentation. So like Christina mentioned, another thing that we're really excited about with this updated version is that we've also released an online version of the planning guide. The idea behind this online version is to allow for a little bit easier access and navigation of the planning guide, and also to allow us to update this a little bit more regularly, and have the planning guide really be kind of a living resource for cities and practitioners, and anyone else who's looking for this type of in-depth guidance around bike share planning. And that online version is available at itdp.org/bikeshare. So what's new in the guide? We really focused on highlighting the major changes in bike share, particularly looking at the impacts of those developments, and whether integrating these sort of new innovations into bike share systems will ultimately help to improve ridership, expand access, and meet other system performance goals. So first, we've seen some new types of bike share bikes come onto the market, particularly pedal assist e-bikes. So these bikes have an onboard battery that assists riders as they pedal. So this makes for a less physically demanding ride. Pedal assist e-bikes tend to be a bit more expensive to purchase and operate than traditional bike share bikes, but they do help to reduce several barriers that people often raise as reasons that they don't bike regularly or that they don't use bike share regularly. So e-bikes are particularly useful, as you can imagine, in hilly cities, and they can be a preferred choice for commuters who don't want to deal with arriving at work sweaty, or bringing a change of clothes. So we've seen pedal assist e-bikes implemented in station-based systems, so full station-based e-bike systems like in Madrid. We've seen them implemented in dockless systems like in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. And we've also seen some hybrid systems that offer both e-bikes and traditional bikes as part of the same system, like in Quito in Ecuador, in Mexico City, and of course the new Velib system in Paris. So we at ITDP are particularly interested in the potential uptake of e-bikes as part of bike share systems in rapidly urbanizing cities where two-wheelers and other highly polluting vehicles are popular. So looking at the opportunity of bike share to potentially replace some of those higher polluting trips. So we've also seen a new operating model for bike share emerge in the past year or so, and that's of course the number of private venture capital funded companies that are offering dockless bike share. There's an enormous opportunity with dockless bike share to actually scale a bike share system affordably, and that helps to allow users to find bikes more easily, as well as gives users the flexibility to end their trip at their actual destination instead of at a nearby bike share station. So Chinese cities are seeing some substantial modal shift away from private cars due to the scale and availability of dockless bike share there. But of course, cities have had to confront a variety of concerns that have been generated around dockless bike share, such as bikes blocking public rights of way, potential for oversupply, user privacy and safety concerns, and more recently, concerns about the long-term financial viability of these companies. So the planning guide provides a policy framework that encourages cities to think more holistically about dockless bike share should they choose that type of system. And we really emphasize the value in proactively adopting outcome-oriented regulations, as well as a clear enforcement strategy in order to really mitigate those negative outcomes before they actually degrade sort of the idea and the potential that dockless bike share actually has. And then finally, we've also seen an evolution in how bike share is priced in a lot of cities, particularly with the introduction of a lower price per trip option, in addition to the more standard monthly or annual membership rates that we typically see being offered from bike share systems. So this lower per trip price makes station-based systems more competitive with private dockless companies in cities where both systems are operating simultaneously. Most of the dockless companies use the equivalent of a $1 per 30-minute pricing model. And it's really simple for users to understand, and it makes sort of more financial sense if users are thinking about using Bikeshare for a one-way trip or on a more otherwise less consistent basis. Still, though, monthly and annual Bikeshare memberships are going to be the most economical option for consistent users. So we don't really envision those pricing options going away, just perhaps the per trip price being added as an additional option. And then some cities are also experimenting with free or significantly reduced cost Bikeshare trips for transit card holders. So a good example of that is in Pittsburgh, where the city is piloting free 15-minute Bikeshare trips for transit card holders in an effort to provide that first or last mile solution for people who are already consistent transit users. So a big question that cities are grappling with at this point is which type of Bikeshare system is best? Is it docked or is it dockless? But in most cases, that's not actually a question about the technology or the equipment itself, but it's a question about the operating model that's being used. So this is a chart from the planning guide where we compare operator scenarios to try to provide a more accurate picture of what a city might expect as far as financing, coordination, and service delivery across different operator scenarios. So in the past, the public-private partnership or PPP model was really dominant in Bikeshare because it allows the city to put out an RFP and then the city works really closely with the winning operator to decide fundamentally how the system is going to be run. So the city has really significant involvement in all major planning decisions and can also demand a level of service that the operator is then contractually obligated to meet. PPPs also allow for cost sharing in most cases between the public and private sector, and that's helped to make Bikeshare more financially viable and sustainable in the long term. But the downside of the PPP model, or one of the downsides, is often these long contracts, 8 years, 10 years, even up to 15 years. And contracts of that length don't necessarily incentivize innovation or really allow the operator or the city to integrate changing technologies and business models that could really improve service delivery. So the rise of these privately operated dockless Bikeshare companies has generated a different type of operating scenario, which is often called a multi-operator scenario. So in this case, the city is less involved in the operational decision making, which becomes the responsibility of the private companies. But cities can and should set overarching requirements that establish a baseline level of service. So on the positive side, multi-operator systems fundamentally generate competition for rides, and that can help incentivize operators to constantly be improving and really responding to the user experience. But multi-operator systems really work best when the city sets clear requirements as part of a permit program or through an MOU to really reduce any kind of race to the bottom behavior, and also to ensure that the system is actually working for the city and for users. And then lastly, some cities have both of these type of operator scenarios working simultaneously. So they may have an existing PPP with a station-based operator, and then one or more private operators also offering a dockless Bikeshare system. So in these cases, it's likely that city staff and processes are already going to be in place to oversee the multi-operator piece. And there could be an opportunity to provide differentiated service to users. So having the station-based system, having a dockless system, perhaps offering e-bikes in one of those. This could be a way to attract new users who may not have considered using bike share in the past. But you can imagine that there will also be an added challenge around integration between the two types of systems. And users are going to likely have to navigate either multiple apps or websites in order to use both the station-based or PPP system and the dockless multi-operator system. So the aim of the Bikeshare Planning Guide is really to gather existing best practices and provide recommendations to cities so that they can design and implement successful bike share systems and also think about growing those systems in the long term. So I'm going to talk through a couple of key recommendations from the planning guide that really underscore the outcome-oriented approach to bike share system design that we encourage cities to take. So first off is identifying goals. When we think about the most successful bike share systems around the world, in Paris, Mexico City, New York City, Hangzhou, these systems have significant buy-in and active oversight from the city. So in their planning stages, these cities really thought through and identified goals for bike share system performance, and also considered how bike share could help to meet broader citywide goals. So the public sector is really taking an active role in defining what bike share can do for the city and also how to get there. So Velib in Paris is a good example. That system was originally implemented as a tool to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the city's climate energy plan. And another good example is in Mexico City, which cited its EcoBC stations close to metro and bus stops in an effort to really complement and expand access to the mass transit network. So in the planning guide, we use this flowchart to visualize how setting goals at the outset, at the early planning stages, really allows for what's called adaptive management. So this allows for more flexibility and responsiveness to the system's performance in the long term. So we start at number one, positioning bike share within city goals. And then once those goals have been identified, cities can make more informed decisions about the type of bike share system that will best meet those goals. So for example, if a city has defined bike share as a way to expand the reach of its transit network, that city might prioritize choosing an operator, or at least incentivizing operators that offer RFID card access to the bikes. Or they might also consider installing technology that allows for reduced fare transfers between transit and bike share, or think about pricing bike share trips similar to transit, which LA just debuted with their $1.75 single trip fare for bike share, which is the same price as a ride on transit. So at this early stage, it's also really critical to define metrics to track progress toward these goals. So indicators like mode share and accessibility by low income users can really help to estimate bike share's broader impact on mobility and access. And then performance-related metrics and ridership data will also shed light on how well the system's actually being used. So it's important for the city to collect this data from operators at the outset and also have processes in place and the capacity to actually analyze that data. So when we think about evaluating bike share system performance, there are really two key indicators for this, daily trips per bike and trips per resident. So daily trips per bike indicates the efficiency and usage of the infrastructure itself, so the bikes. And through our analysis, we've identified a target of about 4 to 8 daily trips per bike, which is pretty common across most well-functioning bike share systems. If daily trips per bike is much higher than around 8, the system is probably undersized, which means there's too few bikes in circulation. And then if daily trips per bike is much lower than 4, that could indicate oversupply. And those systems might want to look into strategies to expand and encourage additional ridership. So then the other important indicator, aside from daily trips per bike, is daily trips per resident. And this indicates how many people are actually using the system. And unlike daily trips per bike, this indicator doesn't necessarily have a prescribed target, but cities should expect to see improvement over time as the system matures and as more people learn about and use the system. So when you look at the two indicators together, like we have on this graph, high performing systems are those with many trips per resident and fall within that 4 to 8 trips per bike per day. So I know it's a little hard to see the numbers on this graph, but the cities are cities like Dublin, Mexico City, New York City, and Barcelona. Bikes per resident is another indicator that's important to track. So when we look at bikes and trips per resident together, like we have on this graph, we can get a sense of the system's ability to really penetrate the market. So typically the more bikes per resident a system has, the more trips the system will generate overall. So we tend to recommend between 10 to 30 bikes per 1,000 residents in order to meet demand. And then as the system starts operating, that number may need to be adjusted based on metrics like daily trips per bike. So out of these 20 cities that we have included on this graph, there's 4, London, Seattle, Dublin, and Mexico City, that actually meet that target of 10 to 30 bikes per 1,000 residents. The second recommendation is to prioritize integration with the city's broader transportation network. So Bikeshare, of course, can provide critical links to transit, to jobs, and to other destinations throughout the city, and really expanding the city's transportation network overall. So given this, Bikeshare really has to be planned as part of a city's transportation network. And that network nowadays, of course, consists of transit, but also taxis and carpools and rideshare and other types of modes. So it's really kind of clear that integration between all these modes and then incentivizing transit and bikeshare over private car trips is really critical. So when we think about bikeshare and public transit, bikeshare is already being used as a feeder to transit in a lot of cities. A US Bureau of Transportation Statistics study showed that 77% of bikeshare stations in the US are already located within 1 block of another public transit mode. And a similar survey done by Bike Plus in the UK showed that 65% of bikeshare trips there are taken in combination with a bus or a train. So citing bikeshare stations or parking areas near transit stops is a good start. It's a start that cities in a lot of cases are already taking, but there are other opportunities for deeper connections between these two modes. So one example is onboard bus and train stop announcements that alert riders of nearby bikeshare connections. Milwaukee has recently implemented that type of system. And then a variety of cities like LA, Mexico City, Montreal, allow transit card holders to use their transit cards to access bikeshare. So of course, there are some major challenges to integration between bikeshare and transit. One is lack of funding. Another is just a lack of staff time to really think about overhauling any existing technology or implementing new technology in order to facilitate those type of transfers. So given that, bilateral coordination between bikeshare operators and city and regional transit authorities will really help to incorporate bikeshare operations into transportation decision-making in a more holistic way. I'm sure it's not a surprise to many of us that bikeshare has been particularly attractive to transportation network companies or TNCs in the past couple of months. I'm sure some of us have heard that Uber recently purchased Jump and now offers Jump's pedal assist e-bikes in its app. And Lyft also recently purchased Motivate. But this trend definitely isn't unique to the US market. Didi, which is a leading rideshare provider in China, has allowed users to reserve OFO bikes through their app. And India-based ride-hailing company Ola, as well as Zoomcar, which is a car rental company in India, both of those companies have launched bike sharing pilots as well. So enabling users to access rideshare and bike share through one app definitely has interesting implications for thinking about shared mobility or mobility as a service. And reducing barriers to shared mobility modes helps to make them easier for users to choose and link together, and ultimately offers more robust alternatives that can actually compete with the convenience of a private vehicle. So cities should be aware that these types of partnerships are occurring, and should be diligent about having clear data sharing requirements in place for both TNCs and bike share operators in order to gain insights into how and why people are using certain modes for certain types of trips. And then just briefly, in many developing cities, bike share will inevitably impact the operation of informal transit, such as cycle taxis, rickshaws, motorbikes, since these are the modes that are currently providing the affordable first last mile connections for most commuters. Positive impacts of bike share might be actually helping to reduce congestion and some of the air and noise pollution that's often associated with these informal modes. But bike share could directly compete with these modes for trips, and that could create some tension with informal transit operators. So like I mentioned, several cities have already prioritized integration between bike share and transit. Some of these are offering free or reduced fare bike share trips, and others are allowing users just to use their transit card to make accessing bike share a little bit more easy. We're not yet sure whether this integration is having an effect on overall ridership, but that would be interesting to kind of explore a little bit further. And in the case of cities like Cologne and Helsinki and LA, the transit agency is the one that is operating the bike share system, and that can make it quite a bit easier to actually implement integration between transit and bike share. And then on the right of this slide is a screenshot that I took the other day, which shows some jump bike locations through the Uber app in Washington, D.C. Some preliminary data has actually started to come out of San Francisco, where Jump has been operating since last year. And it's showing that people have actually started to substitute trips that they would have taken an Uber car for with trips using a Jump bike. And this is especially the case during morning and evening rush hour, which are the big peaks in red on that graph. So the final key recommendation is for cities to have a real in-depth understanding of how bike share can actually expand access, especially for historically underserved populations. In the past, bike share has typically been planned and operated such that a system service area doesn't necessarily reach into less dense, lower income communities. And that fundamentally removes bike share as a convenient point-to-point transportation option for residents of those communities who are likely already underserved by transit or by other services. And then when stations are actually available in those communities, a number of barriers are also present. So these barriers need to be given serious consideration, and cities need to think about strategies that can be put in place to really mitigate the impacts of these barriers. So we list some of these in this chart. I'm not going to go through each of them, but when we look at dangerous roads, for example, this is often cited as a reason that people don't cycle in general, but especially may not be comfortable using bike share if they have to ride on the road in traffic. So cities might think about citing bike share stations or parking areas near or adjacent to any protected lanes in the city, or at least any bike lanes in general. And cities would also benefit from using bike share trip data to help to prioritize building and improving bike lanes on routes that are popularly used by bike share riders and cyclists more broadly. Another barrier that comes up a lot when we think about bike share, especially with dockless bike share, is needing access to a smartphone. So in this case, cities might require or at least incentivize operators to provide an alternative to accessing their bikes without a smartphone. We've seen that in some cities, dockless bike share permits, like in San Francisco. Maybe the company allows their bikes to be unlocked using an RFID card, or they have an onboard keypad. And then cities can also take steps to provide system information on physical kiosks at either stations or bike share parking areas in order to convey that information to users that may not have a smartphone to read that type of system information on an app. So fortunately, many of these barriers can be addressed if cities take these steps. So thinking about committing to specific equity goals at the outset of the planning process, identifying metrics to measure progress toward those goals, and also just really committing to integrating equity into major planning decisions. Cities should really be recognizing this idea that equity and access are critical components to the success of their bike share system, and that they should be measuring both of these over time. There are indicators like bike to resident ratios and the percentage of low income populations who live or work within the bike share service area that are really important to track. And cities should also be sure to communicate to bike share operators their equity goals, as well as the data points that are going to be needed to measure progress toward those goals. So this is, in my opinion, a really exciting time for bike share. Cities really understand the potential that bike share has to shift people away from private cars for short trips. And they're also realizing that bike share plays an important role in the future of sustainable planning and new mobility. So as we look forward to where bike share could go from here, we expect to see a couple of trends, and I'll just go through each of these quickly. So as cities better understand the benefits and challenges that come along with different types of bike share systems and bike share equipment, we can expect to see systems that start to optimize kind of the best of both worlds. So a good example of this is Portland's Bike Town system, which is a hub-centric model. So there's some stations, but users also have the ability to lock up their bike anywhere within that service area. So that's kind of the best of both worlds between a docked and dockless system. Another example is Forward Go Bike in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's a station-based system that offers traditional bikes as well as e-bikes. So giving users more of a choice for what type of bike will work best for different types of trips. And then we have the example of Washington, D.C., which has a well-established station-based system called Capital Bike Share. But DC now is piloting a dockless bike share program that operates in the same area as Capital Bike Share. And some of those dockless companies offer e-bikes. So there's lots of different options for people to access bike share. Next, because of the insights into route preferences and use habits that GPS-enabled bike share bikes provide, we can expect to see more data-driven planning and analysis when it comes to bike share. Even systems that don't use smart bikes are starting to provide this type of information. So Motivate, which operates City Bike in New York, recently launched a program called Ride Insights, and this allows users to opt into this Ride Insights program, and then it uses GPS from the participating users' smartphones to get more detailed information about bike share trips. Obviously this data is really valuable from a planning standpoint. It can help to inform and prioritize siting bike lanes along more heavily used routes. But again, cities are going to have to be really diligent about establishing data sharing requirements and formats for bike share operators so that this data is reliable and usable. Another opportunity for bike share data is to contribute to more seamless integration between modes. So data that's reported from bike share operators, but also from transportation network companies like Uber and even car share companies. All of this data coming in allows for third-party trip aggregation and planning services like Transit App and City Mapper to provide trip planning across multiple types of modes. And this really makes it a lot easier for people to, leave their car in the driveway and make a trip that's using more sustainable options and potentially multiple modes. So then lastly, as I mentioned before, there's really great potential in the collaborations between rideshare companies and bike share. And we expect that these partnerships are going to continue as companies and cities realize the gains that can be made towards multimodality and the adoption of new mobility services. So given the private sector's interest in providing or partnering with bike share, cities may be able to really capitalize on these connections and expand access. But again, clear enforceable requirements for sharing data between private companies and cities is going to be really critical to linking these modes in a way that facilitates convenient, cost-effective mobility for people. So that is the end of the formal presentation. Again, I wanted to share the link to the online Bikeshare Planning Guide at itdp.org/bikeshare. And my email is there as well if you'd like to follow up following the webinar. But I guess at this point, we can move into some questions.
Great. Thank you, Dana, walking us through those updates and also what's next for Bikeshare. So I'll just jump right into the Q&A, and I also encourage our attendees to start submitting some questions now if they'd like. I'll just start from the top here from Miriam. Do you know if there's a bike sharing system which uses energy from pedaling, such as human power, to charge batteries instead of using energy to assist pedaling?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know offhand. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a city off the top of my head, but the way that I understand most of these pedal assist bikes are working is that the batteries are actually swapped out and charged separate from the bike and then reinstalled into the bike once they're charged. But I don't know of any cases where people are actually kind of charging the batteries as they pedal.
Great. Thank you, Dana. Well, if any of the attendees know of a system, feel free to write it in our chat box and let us know. The next question here is from Christopher Moon. And I believe you had a slide before with some high-level recommendations, which included road safety. So the question here is, how difficult is it for cities to collect cycling data, such as average speeds, trip times, travel distance, with the objective of ensuring safety when planning a bike share service? As you mentioned, there are people who may be deterred because they feel that there isn't enough infrastructure for it. So he mentioned cities are already collecting cycling crash data, but these other metrics might be harder to track down. Are there recommendations for how to do this, or best practices from cities that have been successful in doing so?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think in the past, bike share data hasn't necessarily been as robust because most of the bikes being used in systems weren't actually GPS enabled. So the data that we were able to get from the bike share system was really just starting stations and ending stations, but you didn't necessarily, or you didn't get information on the actual route that that rider was taken. And now with the GPS enabled bikes, from dockless bike share, but also some station-based systems that are using GPS-enabled bikes. And with programs like Motivate's Ride Insights in New York, we are starting to get more data about the actual trip routes that are being taken. And that's the kind of data that cities can start to use to do things like prioritizing building bike lanes or improving existing lanes, and working on network connectivity as far as lanes throughout the city. So it has been sort of a bit of an evolution, but I think another key piece of this is having someone on city staff who's really capable of analyzing and applying that data. So I think, it's great that all of this new data is becoming available, but if cities don't have the capacity to actually use it and inform decisions around making cycling safer, it's not as valuable. So it's kind of a combination of collecting that data, but also having processes and staff in place who can really analyze and apply it.
Thank you, Dana. I'll go on to the next question here from Gabriella. Do you have some examples of systems that are integrating underserved communities? Good examples, perhaps not the Ford Go bike in San Francisco.
Yeah, there's definitely more and more bike share systems that are thinking about the equity and access pieces right at the start. So at least in the US, some good examples are Atlanta's relay system. They've done a lot of work with community engagement and hiring community ambassadors and putting together volunteer programs of local community members who kind of go out and educate people about the system, about how to use it, help people, even just register with the system. So that's been really successful there as far as generating ridership outside of the normal or kind of the downtown commuter core. Another good example is Memphis and their Explore bike share system, which just recently launched, I believe earlier this summer. But they have been really committed to siting bike share stations in communities of all, sociodemographic levels. They've done a lot of work on making sure that the service area is really accessible to all parts of the city. So I would say those are Memphis and Atlanta are two really good examples. Philadelphia as well is a good example. And there's a number of cities that are starting to implement these reduced fare annual membership programs. So any of the cities that are really committed to those, I think we're seeing some additional ridership generated there.
Great, thank you, Dana. And I'm just going to take one moment to address questions about the Q&A function. If your Zoom screen is maximized, you should just put your mouse to the bottom or the top of the screen and the different functions should appear. So one of the questions sent through the chat box was, do you have any recommendations for national level planning for bike share? So perhaps you can speak about China had some national strategies as they had engaged bike share operators. But if you can give an example for our audience, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that bike share is kind of legislated at the national level. It's a very local issue, and it, because of different contexts and existing conditions and even topographies of different cities, it really makes more sense to kind of leave it up to cities to figure out how best to manage the system at the city level. The case in China, as far as I understand, is the national government kind of put some loose requirements in place, and then cities sort of built out on that. So we can sort of see how successful that approach is. But outside of China, I don't think any other countries are really taking a national approach.
Great, thank you, Dana. The next question here is really pointing to the actual vehicle structure of bikes that are provided in bike share systems. So this question here is from Amber Johnson. Are providers thinking of ways to incorporate different kinds of bikes that sit two people or allow for someone with limited mobility to sit while someone else pedals?
Yeah, so there's a number of systems that are really thinking about how to incorporate more sort of adaptive bike models to allow people with limited mobility to use bike share. One that comes to mind is actually in Rosario, Argentina. It's a smaller system, but they have a tandem bike they have one tandem bike for every station. There's supposed to be one at every station, but you can imagine as people use them, they sort of end up at all different stations. But that was sort of an approach to allow, people with either limited mobility or vision impairment to still use bike share. There's been some efforts by Portland system and Detroit to offer adaptive cycles as part of pilot programs through their bike share systems. So like trikes and hand cycles. So there's definitely some examples to point to. In some of these cases, it becomes more of a bike rental almost than bike share, especially in the case of like Portland's pilot, where you had to go to a bike shop and actually kind of rent the bike, and then you could ride it around and you return it to that same shop. So it kind of isn't the point A to B trip that's sort of fundamental to bike share, but it still offers, bike access to people with limited mobility. So it's kind of a step towards hopefully something that's a little bit more integrated.
Great. Thank you, Dana, for walking through not only thinking about the bikes themselves, but who are the users for these different bike share programs and how we can be more inclusive of them. So this next question here is from Udaya. With OFO quitting the US, do you think dockless bike share can still expand? Are we going to see any change in the model or perhaps go back to station-based?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one that I don't necessarily have, an answer to at this point. But it seems that with OFO and Mobike pulling out of some cities, there's still a handful of other bike share companies that are continuing to operate in these conditions and follow or meeting city requirements. And still committed to providing service. So I don't know if I don't think this is an indication that dockless bike share isn't working. I think it is an indication that the kind of venture capital induced market share grab is slowly kind of weeding out some of these companies that may not have had as long-term of a business model. But it's something to definitely keep an eye on, and I think something that cities are going to kind of think twice about kind of adopting dockless systems without being really thoughtful about their long-term viability.
Great, thank you, Dana. And this next question here is building a bit off of Udaya's. And you had a slide before, what's next for bike share? So this question from John Ramirez is, how will bike share look in 5 years? Will it all be dockless? Will it be hybrid? All station-based? Where do you think the trend is going?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hard question. If we think back 5 years ago, I'm not sure many people would have imagined that we would be where we are now. But it's always important to kind of look to the future and be proactive and thinking about where we could be going. I think systems that are using kind of a hybrid approach of kind of that best of both worlds scenario where there's kind of the benefits of having some stations, but also the benefits of allowing users to the flexibility to lock their bikes right at their destination is really appealing. The level of infrastructure and upfront capital costs can be a little lower with fewer stations. So, that's appealing from the city standpoint. And from the user standpoint, it seems like in a lot of cases, the bikes that are used in those systems are pretty high quality. But it really comes down to cities thinking about what they want out of bike share and how to design a system that's going to get them there. And that is what we hope to see going forward, is this more kind of outcome oriented thinking about bike share, and not just, implementing a bike share system just to have a bike share system.
Great, thank you, Dana. This next question here is from Florinda, and it's pointing to how to manage public space, particularly with dockless bikes. Here, and I would also like to recommend to look at the policy brief on dockless bike share if you'd like to learn more. But the question is, are there any recommendations for cities on how to leverage bike share as a measure to replace, to increase a number of car parking spaces and move towards curb management for active travel modes?
Sorry, could you read that again, Christina? I don't think I caught the relation to cars parking spaces.
Yes, it says a measure to take out an increasing number of car parking spaces and move towards better curb management for active travel modes.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's some cities that are already doing that. So as towards the end of Seattle's pilot program for dockless bike share, they have been implementing parking spaces for dockless bikes. And several of those have been on street, where they've actually removed, the first parking space and helping to, clear a view for cars that are turning. It's sort of more safe, a more safe design, but also doubly using that space as dockless bike share parking. So there's been some success in that. You can still park the dockless bike share bikes not in those spaces, but providing those spaces does encourage people to use them. And if they're convenient, people will use them. So there have been some cities that are looking at that, and it's definitely, an option for public space management is to create these dockless bike share parking areas. And you can fit a lot more dockless bikes in a parking space than just one car. So when you think about how many people that space is serving, it's much more efficiently used with bikes. But it's something that we'll have to see as cities continue to pilot dockless bike share programs.
Great, thank you. This next question here is from Pietro about hybrid systems. Do cities have data available about these hybrid systems? For example, when users prefer free-floating bikes and when they prefer station bikes? Are there indicators that are provided to measure these, such as how many docks per bike you need?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is kind of important to differentiate hybrid systems from station-based and completely dockless systems. The docks per bike indicator is probably a good one to look at, but I'm not aware of data that's available. I guess it would have to be sort of survey data, looking at user or asking users, how often they use stations versus how often they just lock up the bike to a bike rack or something like that. I mean, it's interesting to see what the preferences are and connected to which types of trips. But I don't know offhand if that data is available. The hybrid system is When we think of like Portland, it's not as common. So there are fewer cities that utilize that system, but it does seem to be becoming more popular because you sort of get the best of both. But I'd be interested to know more about that if anyone does know of those data sources.
Great, thank you. This next question here is from Celio. Does ITDP have information from different cities about the cost of implementation and maintenance of bike share systems?
Unfortunately, that information is pretty difficult to get. We don't have that information, at least at a large scale. Occasionally, systems or cities will publish sort of annual reports almost on the operations and performance of the system year to year. It's pretty rare that systems do that or that they publish it, publicly. So it is really difficult to get accurate information about operating costs, and especially when we think about the costs of rebalancing and other maintenance and other operating costs that come along with operating bike share systems. Unfortunately, that information is pretty hard to come by.
Great, thank you, Dana. So that last question from Celia will actually wrap up our webinar for today. Again, I'd like to thank you for your great presentation and for our attendees for joining us in this session today. As mentioned earlier, this webinar recording and PowerPoint will be available on our website within 2 weeks. And you can also see a follow-up email from me, including all the links. As for upcoming webinars, we will have a BRT Planning Guide webinar with Walter Hook on business plans in September, so please stay tuned. If you have not already, please sign up for the ITDP newsletter to get the latest updates and registration links for our webinars. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you online soon. Thank you.